Well, thank you, Lydia, for that introduction, and welcome to Chapel eWorship. We are so glad that you have joined us here this weekend. We would love for you to know that there are so many different ways that you can connect with us on these weekend messages. Perhaps you're joining us from the Chapel website or Facebook, but we want you to know that you could also find us on YouTube, Roku, or even Apple TV now. We're so glad that you are gathering with us this way so consistently, and your feedback on these online experiences have just been great to read, and to be able to see where you're from, to receive that feedback. We're glad that you're joining us to be able to create this sense of community that we have as, again, we as pastors are here in this very empty and open sanctuary here at the chapel. But as we've been constantly saying, even though the church building is closed, we have seen story after story that has confirmed the statement that the church is very much open. It's alive and well and active, and we are so glad that Jesus Christ has died for us so that we can be a part of His family, be a part of His body, that it is not contained and that His word is not bound. As far from all of the pastors, we just want to say that we miss you and we can't wait until we get back together, and that'll be at the we know that that'll be at the appropriate time. But in the meantime, over these weekends, there are so many different ways that the rest of your family can connect. You can do that if you've got preschoolers or kids who are in elementary school. They're going through series right now that are talking about how Jesus is alive. Our middle schoolers and high schoolers that are part of our programs called Amped or Fused are going through series right now about trusting Jesus in change. But today I am excited that we as adults are going to go through a series called Overcomers. Overcomers for when life is about to overcome you. Because of this incredible circumstance that we find ourselves in, our normal routines are out of whack. What we have been used to week after week after week has really been disrupted. And these circumstances are creating a scenario where it feels like we're being overcome with different things. It just may be we're overcome by our kids and them being in the house every day. Perhaps you wives, it's like, I really love my husband, but I'm seeing him a lot more than I'm used to. For some of you, it may be e-learning and all of the responsibilities that come with that. For some of us, it's the sadness of going through March without March Madness, or the Masters coming and going and it being postponed till later. And even on more serious notes, there may be some of us out there that are listening that are single, that are very alone, saying, I'm lonely and I'm having a tough time overcoming that. The truth of the matter is whenever there is change, life can get messy. It can bring about the possibility that we could make bad decisions. There could be resentment that would settle in, or we could have the urge even to quit. These can be tough times for us. And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be diving into how we can overcome when the messiness of life is climbing. In other words, how do we flatten that curve of the mounting messiness and struggles and obstacles that are in our ways during these unique times. One of the ideas that Rick and I had was to be able to hone in on a verse, which we have done in series in the past, for us to be able to take on the task of memorizing it. The verse that we are choosing throughout this series is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, and I'm going to read through the whole verse here really quick, and it says this: No temptation or trial has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. One of the things that we hope to do is week after week to add a new line to that. So normally here at the chapel, we would ask people to stand and for all of us to say it together. So we're going to do that virtually. What we want you to do is, everyone, if you're listening, if you're on the couch, on the floor, in the recliner, on a chair, we want you to stand up with me right now, there in your room, and be able to say together the first line that I have highlighted in yellow as one voice. Even though I can't hear you, I know that you're saying it out there. So let's do it together. Ready, set, go. No temptation or trial has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. You may be seated. Now, in the beginning of that verse, it says that anything that we go through is not necessarily uncommon, that mankind has gone through these things before. We may look at our circumstances and say there's never been a COVID-19 before, which is true, it is unique, but societies and mankind have been through things like pandemics, and they've been able to come out on the other side. But one thing that is not new is that when it comes to overcoming, what is not new is the idea that overcoming is usually synonymous with victory over your obstacles. That it is usually synonymous with victory over your obstacles. Whenever you sit down and think of an overcomer, you're usually thinking of someone who had a huge obstacle in front of them, and because of something, they were able to overcome it. They were able to achieve victory over those obstacles. Some people that come to mind right off the bat is a young lady by the name of Bethany Hamilton. Perhaps you've heard of her story. She was a professional surfer that one day in 2003 was attacked by a shark and lost her left arm. And the way that she became an overcomer was that obstacle in front of her. She continued to press on, got back on the surfboard and started winning tournaments again. Another overcomer that may come to our minds is, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., whose obstacle throughout different sections and different people in America was systemic racism and bigotry. Dr. Martin Luther King did incredible things like the march in 1963 and declaring that he had this great dream that people would not judge his kids based on the color of their skin, but on the judgment and the content of their character. And what that led to is because of that obstacle in America in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, a huge victory because of the efforts that he and so many other people had. That's usually what we think of when we think of overcomers, that an overcomer and overcoming is synonymous with victory of some sort over our obstacles. But in our lives, it may be hard to see what that is. But one thing that I do want to make sure that we all go away with after the sermon is these truths. That your obstacles, your opponents, your enemy, it's not your kids. It's not your spouse. It's not e-learning. It's not singlehood. It's not a virus. The enemy, the opponent, the obstacle, the greatest one in this world that you and I are facing each and every day, whether rain or shine, is an enemy that is vicious. It's an enemy that is constant, that has been with us from day one and will continue with us every day of our lives. And what we want to do throughout this series is to be able to make sure that there is clarity on what the true enemy is. What is that obstacle in front of us? That God has come alongside us for us to be able to be overcomers and to be able to experience victory in these battles. We see examples of incredible people throughout the Bible that have done this. We are going to eventually talk about Moses, who felt like he had a stuttering and speech impediment to the point that he didn't want to follow God's call to go back to Egypt. But he became a man of faith, and he overcame so many obstacles and saw victory in his life. We could think of people like Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, and yet in the face of sexual assault and lies through the wife of Potiphar, his life continued, and the issues and the mounting obstacles began to climb and climb and climb. But he remained faithful and experienced victory over his obstacles with God's help. So throughout this series, we will be talking about people like that. But today, we're not going to talk about Moses. We're not going to talk about Joseph. We're not even going to talk about great people like David. Today, we're going to talk about someone that you may not expect, and his name is John the Apostle. Now, there's a lot of different Johns in the Bible, and I wanted to be able to imagine what it would be like if John the Apostle had a Twitter page. And in a normal Twitter page, you go to it, and the first couple sentences are basic descriptions of who this person is. And John the Apostle, there's a bunch of different. There's a John the Baptist. But this John the Apostle was a former fisherman in Galilee. He was fishing, as we see here, with his brother James, and he was the son of Zebedee. They had this family fishing business that was going on, and Jesus looked at those two sons, James and John, and said, "Lay down your nets and come follow me," and that's exactly what they did. John the Apostle he would have under his Twitter handle, best-selling author. With respect to the New Testament, he wrote around 20% of it. With 5 different books. The Gospel of John, 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the very last book of the entire Bible that we called Revelation. In his Gospel of John, he usually did not refer to himself by name, but described himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. He was the author. I guess he gets to do that. But as you see this picture of him, he's a very old man. And that's because he was the last of the 12 apostles that survived. Church history has it that so many of them were martyred very in the middle of that first century, maybe even into the 60s or 70s. But what we have here is a very old man, John the Apostle, in the late 80s or early to mid 90s, closing out the end of the century, the last of the 12 apostles that walked with Jesus while he was here in his ministry. Where he finds himself is on the coast of what we would call modern-day Turkey, living in the greatest city in that area called Ephesus. And as he's gazing off into the ocean here in this picture, one of the things to understand is he is writing this first of his epistles, 1 John, that eventually down the road, whether it's weeks, months, years after he wrote these letters, that he was eventually going to be heading to an island of Patmos soon because of his faith in Jesus. And so where is this Ephesus? Where is this Patmos? This next map will give you an indication of where that is. Even though it says Asia there on the map, that is not the Asia with China and Russia, but this is modern-day Turkey. And Ephesus right there in the middle, and the island of Patmos on the left, gives you a little bit of an idea of where things are taking place. Now, if we take an aerial view of Ephesus, I want to be able to share with you something very interesting about this city. It was a major city, but it was filled with, as many important Greek and Roman cities at that time were, it was filled with great polytheism. As you could see, if you were to walk in Ephesus today and you went down that road that leads to that circle area on the bottom right-hand corner of this aerial view, today if you were to do that, you would come across this carving. This is a carving, I don't know if you recognize it or not, but this is a carving of one of the Greek goddesses, and her name is Nike. Nike was not one of the major gods or goddesses at that time like Zeus or Hermes, but she was well known. She was the goddess of victory, and as the Romans took over, her name changed to Victoria. But as you can see in this carving, people in Ephesus, as they would walk from one end of the city to the other, would encounter this image to be reminded that there is a goddess, Nike, out there, who if you, as a Greek and Roman citizen, were to want victory in life, this would be one of the gods that you would go to speak to on your behalf. As we can see here in this picture, one of the things about the Greek goddess Nike is that in her left hand there is a wreath. It is a crown of victory that would be placed. Greek mythology has it that this goddess Nike would fly around when battles or athletic competitions would take place, looking and being ready to crown the victor with this wreath. But not only that, if we fast forward to our recent past in the early 1970s. There was a small company that was up and coming. And the owner of this company hired a young woman for a fee of $35 to be able to artistically draw the logo of this new company. The story has it, and it cannot necessarily be confirmed, that it was at this sculpture, at this carving, there in the folds of the dress, right here where it was circled, was the inspiration for the logo of this company. And that company, as you've already guessed, is the company Nike, where they got this Nike swoosh. And what we see in our closets, in our walkways, is products like this. This is my wife Shelby's shoe that is Nike. It's got the Nike swoosh right there to remind you that if you wear our product, victory is yours. One of the amazing things about shoes like this is how light they are. The idea behind Nike is to be able to create apparel that would help you to be able to achieve victory in whatever that you are engaging into. In other words, Nike exists to help you overcome your obstacles and to defeat your opponents. One of the things that if a person through Ephesus was walking around would realize as they would look at this sculpture is that Nike had 3 siblings. And the names of all of these 3 siblings communicated to everybody what was the key to achieving victory. And as they would pass by, one of the things that they would know, which is the setting where John was writing 1 John, was this, is that Nike taught the ancient Ephesians that victory comes through these 3 things. These 3 things, which were basically the names of the goddesses, Nike's 3 siblings. That the way that you achieve victory, the way that you overcome, is through strength, force, and zeal. In other words, victory meant being stronger, bigger, having more, and wanting it more than the other person. Not much has changed. When it comes to winning on the athletic field, it's strength, it's force, it's zeal. How much do you want it? How much are you going to work for it? What price are you willing to pay to be able to be stronger, bigger, and have more passion than the person across the field, across the conference room, across the country than you? The question for us today is that what it takes for us today to overcome? And as I look at the examples that we thought of earlier, when it comes to Bethany Hamilton or Martin Luther King Jr., I begin to think it wasn't necessarily strength, force, and zeal. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr., when it came to force, that was one of the last things that he wanted to do. Is there something else? Are there 3 other virtues that we can look at on the keys of what it means to be victorious and to overcome the circumstances that we find ourselves today? You see, strength, force, and zeal is not the case for the path of victory for those who are followers of Jesus. And John, the apostle, teaches us something else. One of the most important things as we go through 1 John is that he teaches us that overcoming begins with accurately identifying your opponents. Overcoming begins with accurately identifying your opponents. Since we've been on this quarantine, one of the things that I have lamented as a sports fan is the fact that we didn't have March Madness. We had what people are now calling March Sadness. And so what some of these TV stations are doing is they are broadcasting past NCAA championship games. Some of them I've never seen before, some of them that I've only seen clips, so I've been recording them from time to time, and one of them that I watched in particular was the 1982 Men's National Championship game, which had North Carolina against Georgetown. This was a game that pitted 2 young freshmen against each other from Georgetown, it was a tall 7-foot center by the name of Patrick Ewing, who went on to play, he's a Hall of Famer, went on to play for the New York Knicks. And in North Carolina was a fairly unknown young man who grew up in North Carolina, who was a freshman starter at that time by the name of Michael Jordan. And as the game went on, it was incredibly close the entire time. This was the first time that I had ever seen it in its entirety. And we came down to the last couple seconds, and with about a minute left, the score was 62-61. Georgetown was ahead, but North Carolina had the ball. And in one of the most famous shots in sports history, one of North Carolina's teammates throws it to Michael Jordan with 16 seconds left. He hits a shot to put them up 63-62. Georgetown gets inbounds the ball. They don't have any more timeouts. They dribble down, and the guy handling the ball was one of their guards by the name of Fred Brown. And Fred Brown brings it down, and you can tell he panics. And he turns and looks, and he wants to pass it to his teammate, but someone from North Carolina by the name of James Worthy jumps through and goes past him. Fred Brown turns this way, panics, and throws it to somebody right here, thinking it's his teammate, but actually it's James Worthy from North Carolina who steals the ball, heads to the other way, and the Tar Heels win the championship because Fred Brown was not able to accurately identify the difference between his teammate and his opponents. And what the Apostle John does, which is so important for us, is that too often we mistake people in our lives as being our enemies. We mistake things in our lives and other people as being those who are our opponents. But what John does that is so genius in his letter that we call 1 John is that he begins by accurately identifying who a follower of Jesus is waging war against. And if we were to go back to John the Apostle's Twitter page, we would see a couple small tweets that he would have that would give us an idea of who our true opponents are. And he would say, we would see things like this, where he would say in John 1:6, 1 John 1:6, if we claim to have fellowship with God and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. He shares with us here really quickly that walking in darkness, when we walk in darkness, that is our true opponent. Walking in darkness was synonymous with not walking with God. You and I may be in the midst of our quarantine and our stay-at-home mandates and our 6 feet of separation and social distancing from each other have been brought out of our normal routine. And I'm afraid what it has exposed in us, or maybe I should say instead, hopeful that it is exposed in us, that there are some things that we do in our life where we are actually not walking in the light, in obedience to God, but rather we're discovering ways in our lives where we are actually walking in darkness. There were things in the patterns of our normal days that we were able to maybe even do in secret, that now because of a new norm, we are brought out of that rhythm. And they're exposed that there is a walking into darkness that we have. It's an issue in our lives. As we scroll down John the Apostle's Twitter feed, he then goes on to say this. Another enemy is this, the world. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. When we see this word, the world, especially in the epistle of 1 John, what he is referring to is the different philosophies or the ways of thinking or the ways of life that are attractive to us, that draw us into the intoxications of what they offer. But yet, when we do that, we are actually walking away from God. Things like materialism, this draw within us to be able to want more, to want new. Our certain circumstances that we find ourselves in today has kept us from doing that to what we may be normally used to. For some of us, we may struggle in the world with different types of idolatry. whether that is the idolatry of celebrity, perhaps it's the idolatry of work, that you are finding yourselves having to work from home and having to be away from your normal working circumstances. You're realizing that there is this warring inside of you, that you love that maybe a little too much. But then he goes on in his next tweet as we scroll down a little farther, and he shares with us and identifies clearly another obstacle, another opponent of ours, when he says this: who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. When he says the word liar, he's referring to the fact that there are people out there that in Ephesus or the places that he is sending this letter out to, that there are teachers out there that are giving a false impression of who Jesus is. And a big part of what he's writing in here is to be able to make sure that those that are hearing this know who Jesus is accurately, and that the true opponents that followers of Jesus have are anyone, or even ourselves, who are bringing ourselves to be able to deny that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Savior of the world. And if you were to scroll down one more, he would say this: listen, if you're wondering who your opponents are, he says, in other words, your real opponents are when you walk in darkness, when you find yourself loving the attractiveness of this world, or even if you find yourself denying Jesus, that maybe there have been people in your life who have talked you into walking away from him or never believing in him in the first place, that there is no God out there is no hope, all we have is us, in reality that we are merely electromechanical machines. But what the Apostle John says is that when it comes to following Christ, when it comes to truly overcoming in this world and on the other side of eternity, the opponents in this life are when we find ourselves not walking in the light but in darkness, when we have this love for the world instead of the right things that he will share in just a moment, and that when we deny Jesus. Our real opponents are all the influences that pull you and I away from God. These involve our inner desires and the outside temptations that the world offers. But as I've had such a great time talking to so many people through this, is what I've realized is that what change has done in our lives today through this COVID-19 pandemic is what I believe that it has done is it has exposed the habits that we created of giving into our eternal desires and outside temptations. That you and I, when our normal rhythm of predictable outlets to those vices are disrupted, we're realizing that we're beginning to lose, not win. That because of what is going on right now, that our rhythms are disrupted to the point that we are realizing that we're not overcoming, we're struggling. The way that is manifesting itself out can be in many different ways. Maybe you find yourselves being more sharp with your kids at home. One of the important things that John would tell us is that, listen, it's not them. That it very well may be because you, as a parent, I as a parent, am walking in the darkness. Maybe it's manifesting in the way that you can't be at work in the way that you want to, and you have this fear that something is going to happen. Some achievement is going to take place. Some deal is going to get done. Or that guy is in your way of you getting to where you want to be. The truth of the matter is what John would say if he was sitting with you right now. Listen, he's not the enemy. It's your love of the world. And some of us may be saying, nothing in this pandemic makes sense. And I see people dying and loved ones in my life have died. I don't see any victory in any of this. And what John would say is, it's not the virus. It's denying Jesus. And so the question is, how do I overcome that? And the good news is that disruptions like this are opportunities for overcomers to begin to rise up. And what John does in 1 John here real quick in just 4 very short verses gives 3 counterpoints. 3 counterpoints to the goddess of Nike, who says, victory is found in strength, it's in force, and it's in zeal. But John has 3 counterpoints in 4 short verses to what it means for a follower of Jesus to overcome. 1 John 5:1, he begins by saying that we must overcome with love. He says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. He begins by saying that the way that we overcome is not through hatred. It's not through walking in darkness. It's through love. And one of the great things that he says here in this verse is, look at this, is when you come to believe in Jesus, you are born again, that you are born of God. And everyone who loves the Father, you're born into this new family where now God is your Father. Look what it says here. Everyone who loves the Father loves the Father's child as well. The idea here is that when you come to a faith in Jesus, when you begin to follow Jesus, you are a part of a new family, that you have a Father in heaven, and that the other people around you in your lives are now your family. They're not your enemy, and they're not your opponent anymore. They're not a stranger. They're not an inconvenience. They're not an annoyance. The people around us now are children of the same Father that you have. You were born into a new family, and I can certainly relate to that. I was born in February 28th, 1978, and my name was Brandon Gerald Smock on my birth certificate. I never knew my biological father, didn't really know much about him throughout my entire life, but a few years into my life, my mom married a wonderful man by the name of Jim Holler, and a few years into their marriage, he adopted me as his son, and I became Brandon James Holler. When I was 10 and a half, my parents made one of the best decisions they ever made in their lives, which was to adopt what became my brother Joshua James Holler. And if you were to look at him, and if you were to stand next to me, you would say there's no way in the world those two are brothers. If you were to look at me, that I have a bald head and he has a head full of hair. If you were to look at me, you would see that I'm white and you would see that he is black. But what I understand that maybe not everybody understands is this, is when I look at him, despite all of the differences that he and I have, I don't see the head full of hair. I don't see that he and I have different color. I see my brother. And my love for him is overwhelming. And the reason that I love him, and the reason I love him in the first place, is because my Father adopted him into our family. And the reality is, we may be going through this spike of tough times, and it probably has to deal with other people that are triggering responses inside of us. And one of the things that John is saying, that in order to overcome, our response must not be to explode in anger at that person because they're an annoyance or they're an inconvenience, but to always be reminded that they are a child of the same Father that you have, that you are a part of the same family. When you come to a person from now on, what the Apostle John would say is that you need to say, I don't see an enemy. I don't see an inconvenience or an annoyance. I see a child of the Father. And we are to love them as if they are that, which they are. The second thing John says is in 1 John 5:2-3 is that it involves obedience to overcome. And it's amazing how tied love and obedience is, as we see here. He says this is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is the love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome. For the person that obeys God greatly, more than likely it's because his love for God is great. For the person that does not follow, is obedience to God is low, is probably because their love for God is low. They are so tied together and are so the same. And one of the great things that John says in here is his commandments are not burdensome. And what that means is that there used to be 613 of them. And what Jesus did when he came, and he says it really boils down to this, is to love God, love others. Jesus even gave a new command in John 13, where he says, love one another as I have loved you. And so when it comes to obedience, why it's not burdensome is because it's simple, that we look at the way that Jesus loved people and we do what he did. That it's simple, that it's not burdensome and heavy. It's a lighter path that when we choose to obey him, life gets smoother. All obstacles won't go out of the way, but as time goes on, as truth and time travel together and you walk in obedience, you will see that it was the better way to go. And it's also not burdensome in the fact that you and I have help. When you come to a faith in Jesus, the same power that rose Jesus from the dead now lives in you. It reminds me anytime I go through an airport with my family and I've got all of these things that I'm carrying. I'm carrying strollers and car seats and maybe even a kid. And you get to this point where you, in Fort Wayne Airport in particular, where you get to go to your gate and there's this escalator. And I remember having all of this heavy stuff and then hitting the escalator and just going, When it comes to obedience, Jesus' commands are not burdensome. They're not heavy. They're like coming up onto an escalator and having that burden lifted because you have God with you as well. And the third thing that John tells us and what it means to overcome, we see is to have faith. Verse 4 and 5, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. All the great overcomers in the Bible are people of faith. We can think of Abraham and Sarah, their faith that they would have a son. We can think of Joseph in his obedience and his faithfulness to God, and Moses believing that God could do what he said he could do. But you know, the greatest enemy to overcome is the enemy of sin and death, and where Jesus Christ became that great victor. And what John makes sure that we know is that victory for us began because Jesus first was the victor. One of the great things that he does in these two verses is he uses a Greek word 4 times that's translated overcomes or victory. That Greek word is Nike, where we get the word Nike. Who is it that Nike the world, who overcomes the world? What does it mean to overcome? What does it mean to achieve victory? He says only the one who begins by believing that Jesus is the Son of God. That's where it all begins. That's where overcoming starts. By placing your faith in the victor who did the winning for you. You see, the Greek goddess Nike taught that it takes strength and zeal and force to be able to achieve victory. But John taught the ancient Ephesians that victory comes through these 3 things: love, obedience, and faith. As we go through these examples over the next couple weeks, I want you to hold on to those 3 things and observe their love for God, their obedience to Him, and their faith in God. What's going to get you and I through this? And as we have these false things that we mistake as obstacles in front of us that really are, may we be reminded not only of the real enemy that is out there, which is walking in darkness, which is other things that John says there in his epistle. May we never forget that the way to overcome those things is through love, obedience, and faith. When I look at this shoe, I think of love. I think of my wife, Shelby. I get reminded that there was a time when that she was not a part of my family, but that we made that eternal commitment to each other. And love for each other began to pour out more and more. I think of how light these shoes are and how John tells us in these epistles that the commandments of Jesus, that they're not burdensome, that they're actually light. And as I see this symbol come across this shoe, this this Nike symbol of victory, I'm reminded that Jesus won the victory so that I could accept that gift from him. You know, we've bought shoes for our children in the past. Some of them have been Nikes. And one of the things that's true about that is that our kids didn't earn them. And in some cases, maybe they didn't even deserve them. But it was a gift that we gave them as loving parents, giving to their children. One of the things that begins overcoming for all of us is we can look. If you're a follower of Jesus, you can look back to this point. If you're not, that can start today. That God holds out a free gift to you to begin a relationship with him and to become a child of God through faith in his Son, Jesus. My hope throughout this, as long as it endures, and perhaps for the rest of our lives, that we would pray a prayer that would maybe be like this from this point forward. God, lead me to love fully. God, lead me to obey freely. But God, thank you and lead me to trust firstly. Lord, we love you. We are grateful for all that you have done for us. Your grace and your mercy is overflowing. We pray, and I want to pray for everyone out there that is struggling, and that they would realize that it comes through love, obedience, and faith that we will come through this in the end. Because you are the victor. You are the one who has won the battle over sin and death. That we may even have the opportunity of victory anyway. We love you. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We are going to throw it to Avery, who is going to lead us in an amazing song entitled Healer. In the midst of that song, we see lyrics like this: Jesus, you are all I need. Join her as she sings this song as a prayer for us to lead us into the rest of this week. God bless.